Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports, joins us on 365 Sports. And your takeaways of we have Notre Dame and we have Ohio State ready to play on Monday night.
Well, I'll tell you what, there is one person who picked this game going into the playoff, and that was me. I did think that these two teams would be the two remaining at the end, but I think that these have just been two teams on sort of different trajectories, but who have kind of come together at that right time. Of course, for Ohio State, it was that game against Michigan that ultimately cost them a spot in the Big Ten championship game, and they fought back. They played really well in the college football playoff. They survived a great test from Texas, and now they're going to play for a national championship. And for Notre Dame, I mean, it was week 2, right? They played Northern Illinois in week 2. They fall apart. They've won 13 straight games since then. They've lost an unbelievable amount of talent on the offensive and defensive line to season-ending injuries, and they've just kept going to this point. So I think that these are two resilient teams, two teams that have come back from some setbacks, and I think we're going to have a really good national championship game.
What do you think about Notre Dame's ability to, if this game gets a little bit, I don't think it's going to get big score pointy, and I know that's not a real term.
You mean high scoring? High
scoring. Thank you. Yeah.
Score pointy. I think it counts.
You know what? You put that on CBS and you're going to win a Pulitzer right there. You can just thank me in your acceptance speech. But I don't think it's going to be very high scoring. But if it gets into at any point a bit of a touchdown trading fest, can Notre Dame keep pace with that?
No. I don't think that they can. You look at these first couple of games, and in the 3 college football playoff games that they've had so far, they've outscored their opponents 42-0 in the first quarter. And you look at that game against Texas. Texas managed to keep it relatively close, and that's how they were able to hang around. They were only down 7-0. But you kind of just have to understand that you might fall yourself into a gap in this game. Now, for Notre Dame, they're very, very, I don't want to say dependent on game script because they just came back from a 10-0 deficit, but they want to control the game. They want to slow you down. They want to play at their pace. They don't want to be rushed. And that's one thing when you're playing against a team like Penn State, who, yes, can put up some points, but isn't going to put up 25 points in a hurry. But this is a different challenge going against Ohio State, who has 4 or 5 players who have the ability to change the game in one play. For Notre Dame, I think it's going to be fascinating to kind of see how do you respond to that kind of pressure? How do you respond to the realization that the game could change on one play? And I think the other direction, like if you're Notre Dame, the answer for you just has to be you have to hang on to the ball. You have to put together long drives. This is a team that excels at doing that, both because of the strength of their running backs. Of course, Jadarian Price, a kid from out here in Texas, from Denison, but also Jeremiah Love has been a big-time player for them at running back. And Riley Leonard has probably been their most important overall player during this run to the national championship game. You just look at what he was able to do in that game against Georgia, only threw for 90 yards, but had 80 yards on the ground and converted multiple key 3rd and 4th down conversions. So if you're Notre Dame, that has to be the game script. You have to keep it slow, and you got to keep your hands on the ball.
Shehan, we were talking about the Texas declarations, and they're up to like 14 guys at this point, around that 15 mark, because I wasn't even counting Quinn Ewers and whatever he ends up doing. But 2 years in a row of falling short, literally like at or near the goal line in the semifinals. All these guys going off to the NFL, it's very rare when you see Texas actually not be as talented as somebody. A team that's losing 14 NFL players. Ohio State looked like a more talented team still. That's just how crazy good the Buckeyes are. But what were your thoughts about UT, Sark, the call at the end, just all of the talk about them coming out of that game?
Thinking of sending someone a boring gift basket? Don't. I know, gifting is hard, but don't give basic. Gift Boardery. Fully arranged gourmet charcuterie boards. Perfect for any occasion. Birthdays, engagements, thank you gifts. Boardery has you covered. Plus, if you forget to get a gift, Boardery ships overnight nationwide. So no more excuses, Cheryl. Don't gift basic. Gift Boardery.
Well, I mean, look, like you said, it's very rare, especially with this roster at this time, to see them play somebody and not be the more talented team. And certainly based off of their time in the Big 12, they basically never had games like that where they weren't the most talented team on the field. But Ohio State is one of those teams that can just do that to you. And I think even, look, I think that Texas overall was probably a little more talented than Georgia this year, but they were in the same conversation, right? Georgia was a team that could easily hang with them from that perspective. And, to first touch on the game, I mean, that call on 2nd and 1 at the goal line is one that's going to live infamously for a long time at the University of Texas. He explained the call after the game, and basically the thought was, look, we ran our heavy set, we ran our heavy package, we got our heavy running back Jared Gibson into the game, and basically made no impact. And this is a team, of course, that hasn't been elite running the ball, certainly hasn't been elite running the ball up the middle, and so they go to the toss, and they end up losing 7 yards on the play. And the reality to me is, I get it, right? Like, I get that you're playing one of the best defensive lines in all of college football. There's a chance that you maybe just don't get it. But if you are at the goal line, there are 2 things that you can't do. One is you can't lose yardage and you can't lose space, which Texas did that on the 2nd and 1 play. And you can't turn the ball over, which they did, of course, on the 4th down play. Those are the 2 things you can't do. And Texas did both of them in one possession. So I think that people are going to question that call for a long time. Look, part of it was that Ohio State safety Caleb Downs just made a tremendous play. You go back and watch that game. He just shoots the gap. He just sees it developing. And if he doesn't make that decisive of a play at that moment, maybe the play works. But still, I just don't think it was the right call in that moment. And, you refer to the amount of guys who are going to be gone from Texas after this season. I mean, look, they lost a ton last season, too. They lost Xavier Worthy. They lost Adonai Mitchell. They lost Devondre Sweat. They lost Byron Murphy. But I do also think that we can look back at this year now and say, for the most part, the places where they lost a lot were worth units in 2024 than they were in 2023. I kind of pointed to wide receiver as not a warning sign in 24, but I just thought that they weren't going to be as elite as they were in 23. They lost Jonathan Brooks, of course, to the NFL after that season. They were not as good at running back. While I think that they were still very good at defensive tackle, they weren't as good as they were the year before. And now you lose 4 out of 5 offensive linemen. You lose your top 3 pass catchers, including tight end Gunnar Helm. You lose both of your safeties, and potentially, more could be coming down the line as well. And you lose 3 of your starting 4 defensive linemen as well. So, it's just really hard to not necessarily maintain there, but to continue to grow at those positions. And look, Texas has already been, I've seen, a popular preseason number 1 selection. I think they're still going to be very good. I expect them in the college football playoff. Number 1 is a lot for me.
Yeah, and that's even with being able to refill the pipeline. And here's what we were talking about: how many players are leaving for the draft. Take what you think from the roster they have now, including the commitments, and add 3 as a possibility because of the transfer portal that they'll add to the mix that are going to be NFL players next year.
Yeah, that's true. That was going to throw that in, Shehan, in that. All right, this is not an era of okay, well, you rebuild, you reload, whatever you want to call it. The transfer portal shake things up. And even if you feel really good and you have this super elite team, you don't know how the moves are going to pay off for those teams on your schedule next year. And Texas gets the other side of the one they had this year where they're on the road a ton. So now there's just different landmines they have to navigate as opposed to 2024.
No, I agree. And look, you start the season, by the way, by playing the team that you just lost to. You go on the road against Ohio State. And now, I will say, too, Ohio State's going to lose a lot more even than Texas does this year because of some of the guys that lose to the draft. But they'll bring back arguably the 2 best players in college football in wide receiver Jeremiah Smith and safety Caleb Downs. So, you expect that they're going to be a really good team still, even with some of the losses and defections. And then, you head into the season. And I think that the SEC, certainly during this first season, did Texas a favor. This was a very manageable schedule. They actually, it's kind of crazy to look back on. They made the national semifinals and will not have beaten a team that was in the top 10. But next year, like you mentioned, going on the road a whole lot more. You do get the return game of Texas A&M. You absolutely imagine that Oklahoma is not going to be as bad as they were this past season. Florida suddenly looks like a very different kind of challenge, especially since DJ Lagway won't be hurt, you'd assume, in the matchup next year. So it's more landmines to me, like you said. I still think that this team is, like I mentioned, a playoff team, but you're looking more at the 9 to 10 win range, I think, than the 11 to 12 win range, which is where Texas has been each of the last 2 years.
Shehan, how nervous should Colorado fans be about their head coach and his NFL aspirations, if there are any NFL aspirations for Deion Sanders?
It's a great question, right? I mean, I think the fact that he's having these conversations means that he's at least somewhat serious about it. And, look, here's the reality, right? Like, if you could say right now, for example, that you could guarantee that the Raiders were going to get Shedeur Sanders, well, like, I think that Deion might take that circumstance, but obviously they have to make a hire before they have any idea what's going to happen in the NFL draft. I don't think he's ultimately going to leave. I think that ultimately he will stay at Colorado, but it does say that he has aspirations, that he is looking around and saying, hey, how high can I take this thing? How far can I go? And look, when you look at the success that he had at Jackson State, of course, it was a similar situation. He ended up looking at the next level. And at Colorado, whatever you want to say about how they finished the year, I mean, they won 9 games. That's a pretty impressive turnaround from where they started. So I do think that they should be a little nervous, but I ultimately do think that Deion Sanders is going to stick around. And look, when you look at the way that they've restocked for the 2025 season too, they've got Caden Salter coming in from Liberty. They've got Julian Lewis coming in, a really highly rated quarterback recruit. I think that he sees enough of a future that's worth sticking around for.
Shehan, we have the game Monday night, the championship game. I feel like it's been good. I feel like overall, I know that no one's ever going to be happy when you have to cut it below 1. I mean, you cut anything over 1. Always going to be someone that thinks they should get in. But in the end, there were blowouts. There were blowouts over the weekend in the NFL. Your thoughts about where we are now that we're on the cusp of a championship game?
Oh, I think that this has been an unbelievable success. And people are going to focus on, of course, the games themselves, which is a huge part of it. And I think that you look, and we've had some incredible quarterfinal games. We had some incredible semifinal games. The other piece that I'll say, too, is that when you see blowouts in college football, like it's just different than pro sports. And one of the reasons for that is oftentimes when you see a blowout in college football, it's because you have a group of 18, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds who stand up and do something incredible. Like I look at that Ohio State-Tennessee game, for example, and like it turns out Ohio State just turned a corner. It actually told us something about that Ohio State team, the way that this game went. I look back, even everybody was complaining so much about the Indiana game. Turns out Notre Dame's just pretty good. Turns out that they were going to play for a national championship. Turns out we didn't need to push all the panic buttons and go on College Game Day and say they didn't deserve to be there. We didn't have to do all of that. But I think that the other piece, too, that I want people to understand is don't just look at the playoff itself. Look at the way we were able to watch the entire 2024 season. I had more people ask me about Boise State and UNLV and Tulane this year than any year that I've been covering college football. People followed the Big 12 championship race even closer, which meant, 7, 8, 9 teams for many of these weeks. People followed SMU and Miami and Clemson, and people paid attention to South Carolina in a different kind of way. Like this was a more complete college football regular season than any that I've ever covered in my more than a decade covering college football. And I think that a lot of that just has to do with the playoff. There are things that need to be worked out, certainly. Like I was somebody heading in, I really felt strongly that we need to make sure that we are that we're benefiting conference champions, that they have a really good incentive, because I wanted to value conference championships more. I don't know, after sitting here and watching that, whether it was reasonable for the 4 seed to be the number 12 team in the rankings. I think that that's a conversation that maybe we can have later. But overall, I mean, this was a tremendous system. I think the right 12 teams clearly got in. I think that we got a tremendous product, and I think we got a tremendous season because of it.
You're saying that more people asked you about some programs that otherwise they would never care about, with all due respect to them. Or even South Carolina, when you added that, or SMU and even Miami, that was cool. And of course, the Big 12 was so many teams that had a chance to win that otherwise they would be focused on the 4 to 6 helmets, blue bloods, and the other stories this year were able to be told.
You still got that. At the end. You got the bluest of the blue bloods, and the fact that some people would rather Notre Dame not have a chance because they lost to Northern Illinois in week 2 versus beating Indiana, Georgia, and Penn State back to back to back. It's like they earned it. They absolutely earned it. In the old ways, they would have lost that game and just been out of the mix. And so, I mean, it's it's not a black and white comparison, but I'm with you, Shehan. We talked more Indiana football than I'd ever imagined we'd talk about in my lifetime over the past 2 months,
And I'll tell you what, too. Think about this for a second, right? I think that anybody can look around and look at what Ohio State and Notre Dame have done over the past 3 games and say these teams are clearly the 2 that deserve to play for a national championship. Mm-hmm. In a 4-team playoff, neither of them would have made it.
Yep.
And by the way, if we're talking in a 2-team BCS, we're having Oregon versus Georgia, and neither of those teams won a single playoff game. Both of them lost games by at least 2 touchdowns. So this has been a really fun system. There's going to be some getting used to. There's no question about it. Some teams are going to feel like their season matters. Their regular season matters a little bit less. But as somebody who covers 134 programs every single day of the year, I can tell you that's not the case for most of them.
That's a great point. Shehan, thank you very much, buddy. Appreciate your time. Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports, with us on Tuesdays, and maybe again next week, the day after we find out who wins the national championship.